next talk is by Meena Mahajan, and I ask my colleague Yadu to introduce her.
So it's my pleasure to welcome Meena here. So Meena is a professor at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences in Chennai. She did her undergraduate studies at IIT Bombay and obtained her doctoral degree at IIT Madras. Academic interests span most of theoretical computer science. Her research focuses primarily on understanding the limits of efficient computation and touches upon many aspects of complexity theory, including Boolean function complexity, algebraic circuits, and proof complexity. And personally, as a student at IMSC, I think I've taken around 4 courses taught by Meena, and she's an excellent, very inspiring teacher and speaker as well. So she'll be talking about proofs and computation.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk here. I'm going to be talking about a fairly broad area, proofs and computation and their interaction, but really speaking, this is a proof complexity talk with as little of the complexity as possible. Let's see how it goes. Okay. So when we say proofs, of course, it's what exactly we mean by this depends on who is saying it and to whom. There are proofs and there are proofs and there are so many different kinds of proofs. Why are there so many different kinds of proofs? Because the level of detail required in the proof obviously depends on who's going to read the proof or who's going to listen to the proof. It depends on the ability of the proofreader. And what we mean by ability at a very informal level, there's some mathematical maturity when we're talking about human beings, the facts which are already known to the checker. So there's some database of knowledge which can be used to check that the proof is right, the time available with the checker. All these factors play into how we will decide finally whether this is a valid proof or no. Why are there so many different levels associated with each of these factors? That's because proofs are coming up in many different settings. Proofs have a role to play in all kinds of transactions, in computation, in cryptography, in pure mathematical discourse and reasoning. So what is it that we expect from proofs? What are the minimum requirements? So the nature of proofs, they should be easy to verify. A proof which cannot be verified is completely useless. But easy to verify in what sense? So for those of us who have seen enough of complexity theory, there's a whole lot of stuff which is hidden away into this, the nature of proof. We start with one of the most basic problems, which is the P versus NP problem. And we say, okay, NP problems are those where proofs exist and are easy to verify, but we don't know how to find them. So proofs must be easy to verify. But already there the question arises, what exactly do we mean by verify? And we understand we mean polynomial time verifiability. But then, we have gone so much beyond that. We have said, well, the verification, possibly it can use randomness. Then you get these Arthur Merlin games. Merlin provides the proof and then with some randomness you check whether it's correct. Or we may say that the proof may be supplied in an interactive format. The prover and the verifier are talking to each other. And then in this format, if the verifier is also allowed randomness, then you go all the way up to P space. So the nature of the proof changes a lot depending on what kind of problem we are trying to tackle. Now, another factor which comes into the role of proofs is how many probes you are allowed into the proofs. Again, this comes from, in complexity theory, probabilistically checkable proofs, which can be checked with very few probes into the proof. Increasingly nowadays, proofs are becoming machine checkable. So we are not talking about human beings and their individual mathematical maturity or ability. We are talking about whether we can write programs which will, given a proof in a specific format, check that the proof is valid. And this means that the proof must adhere to a very rigid syntax. It must use very unambiguously specified inference rules, because once you have written the algorithm to check it, it's not going to deviate from there. So proof syntax has to be specified very rigidly. And then this is what brings us to what we study in the complexity of proofs. So the complexity of proofs, in some sense, the origin comes from not just feasible checkability, efficient checkability, but from decidability itself. So earlier you would ask, is a first order logical formula valid at all? And then it turns out that this question, is it valid? This question is not even decidable. There is no algorithm for this question. The computational resource bounded version of this would be that you have one possible bounded resource question would be that you have a propositional formula and you want to ask whether it is valid. Does it become true at all possible settings to the variables? Now this, it's not that there is no algorithm at all. It's not even that there is no efficient algorithm, it's just that we do not know whether there is an efficient algorithm. So the decidability or undecidability has been replaced by tractability. And therefore in this setting, now we want to talk about how efficient it is to check whether a proof is valid. But then, given that we have come down to notions of efficiency, we should also be asking how long the proof needs to be in itself. So that's where the proof, the complexity of proofs comes in. How complex do the proofs themselves need to be? And that is the first question. And then the second question is, how complex is the task of checking whether the proof actually holds? And of course, the answers to these are going to depend on the specific proof system that we use. Like I said, because we are talking about proofs which are eventually going to be machine checkable, the syntax is very rigid and the inference rules are specified very clearly. So proof complexity, if you think of it in this sense, where we are asking how complex the proofs need to be and how complex is the task of checking a proof, then you would think that proof complexity is really a commentary on look at different logical reasoning approaches and try to understand what are their relative strengths and limitations. In certain proof systems where certain inference rules are allowed, maybe the proofs become very short because a whole lot of stuff is pushed into the database. You can use it as a known fact. And there may be other systems where you really build up everything from scratch and then the proofs become correspondingly longer. Sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, so it sounds like a lot like the things we need to assume in cryptography, right? Like you just don't know the feasible algorithm, so you believe it to be intractable. So I just had this random question that is there any cryptography known from these kinds of intractability problems?
Yeah, there is. So I think I will come to it. So some connections to cryptography will also come, but not very many, a few. Yes. Yeah. Thanks for that question. So just to wrap up before I move to the next slide, it looks like proof complexity is talking about the strengths and limitations of reasoning approaches. So viewing it this way, it is not necessarily linked to computation, to computational efficiency, except for the fact that we have said, okay, a proof needs to be checked. And that is a computational task because we are looking at machine checkable proofs. So if we think of just how long does a proof need to be, seemingly it is independent of computational constraints, but we have already said that unverifiable proofs are useless. So the complexity of verification is usually built into the definition of what would constitute a meaningful proof system. And therefore, it's no accident actually that you think of the first paper which set the stage for NP completeness and the study of tractability and intractability. The title of the paper had theorem proving procedures. The title was not computational complexity or resource bounds or something. And that was a paper in 1971. 8 years later, there was another paper also by Stephen Cook along with his then PhD student Robert Rekhow, and that's where they laid the foundations of what we today recognize as propositional proof complexity. And of course, we are going to go well beyond propositional proof complexity. Propositional proof complexity is not enough for the kinds of things that we want to do. But the foundations of this rigorous study were laid in this 1979 paper, and there the title was very clear, relative efficiency. So efficiency made it to the title. In the first paper, we laid the foundations of proof complexity. So what are the major questions concerning proof systems? Okay, so if we just think of proof systems in this very vague and hazy way, which I have not yet formalized as rigid syntax and unambiguous set of rules, then what kind of questions can be asked? We can of course ask how hard is it to verify a proof in this given system. We could ask how long do the proofs need to be for specific theorems, for specific statements. Some statements will have short proofs, some will have long proofs. What is it that affects the length of a proof? What are the factors that determine the length of the shortest proof? Where exactly is the hardness coming from? So for theorems which have proofs, but the proofs seem to be inordinately long, can we understand what is it that is making them hard? And this is a seemingly innocuous question, but there are very surprising answers. For instance, there are a whole lot of statements which to us are completely obvious. You cannot take n+1 students and give them all single rooms if you have only n rooms. This is a statement which there are much used syntaxes in which you write this as a propositional formula. It's obviously unsatisfiable, and a proof of this in that system would require exponentially many derivation steps. So it's our intuition for what is easy and what is not easy hinges on many very different things from what a machine would think is easy. Okay? So we would like to understand better where exactly the hardness is coming from and how we can get around it, in what ways. So that's a very high level meta question. A more concrete question would be, can we determine the optimal length of a proof? You have fixed some proof system. So whatever inference rules and so on, that's all fixed. And now here is a statement which you want to prove in this system. You don't know how long the proof is going to be. So it's not just one statement. Typically, because we want to talk about asymptotic analysis, we have a family of statements. The proof length will depend on where you are in that family, at what length. Can we determine the proof length?
So this pigeonhole example you gave, you're saying that there is no proof system in which this admits an
Oh, no,
efficient-
I'm not saying. There are proof systems which are widely used in practice, and I will come to what we mean by using a proof system in practice. There are proof systems widely used in practice where the pigeonhole principle, the negation of that is hard to prove. But there are other proof systems where it is easy. It cannot be the case that it's always
Yeah,
hard.
that's what I was wondering.
No, but
So then isn't there then some sort of hierarchy of these?
yes, there is. Yes. So that's what I will come to. So what we are asking in this fourth bullet point, can we determine the shortest proof length? Now this is a kind of meta question. You're not just asking somebody to find a proof, but to determine how long the proof has to be, or even to approximate it. And these are questions which one could ask about any proof system. Presumably, if the proof system is very weak, it should be easier to answer this question. If the proof system is stronger, it should be harder to answer this question. That does not quite match what we know today. I will come to that very soon.
Also, how do you quantify? I mean, I can think of vague ways in which, depending on, for instance, how hard is it or how long is the proof for a certain statement, maybe we think that one proof system is stronger than another, but there must be some more rigorous way of quantifying
Okay,
this.
so the question is about how does one compare proof systems, and this is similar to the question of how would one compare problems, computational problems, how would one compare languages. There we have the notion of reductions. Language A reduces to language B if an efficient procedure translates instances of A to instances of B, preserving the decision. For proof systems, we can also come up with a fairly similar definition. It's called a simulation. A proof system B simulates a proof system A if any proof in the system A can be transformed into a proof in the system B with only a polynomial blow in size. Okay? That would be a simulation. I could go further and say, is there a P simulation? That not only can I transfer one proof to another proof without too much of a blow up, I can even do this transformation efficiently. Then that would be a P simulation. So exactly like we have reductions which allow us to compare languages, we have simulations which allow us to compare proof systems. Okay?
Since you also talk about verifying a proof, what computational power do we assume on the verifier?
So that what computational power, that's going to vary depending on where we are sitting in this entire landscape. Typically, we would expect it to be polynomial time because that's our notion of tractability, but sometimes we would be willing to go beyond that as well. Yeah. Okay, the last question which I have up here is a question like this. Are there something called the most powerful or optimal proof systems? And again, in analogy with the question about languages, which was asked earlier, if you think of a computational complexity class like NP, you can ask, is there a hardest language there? Yes, there is. We have NP complete languages. So I could think of proof systems which are able to prove theorems which reside in NP or which reside in co-NP, or fix some complexity class, ask for proof systems in which you can prove theorems in that class, and then ask, is there a most powerful proof system? Because we have a way of comparing proof systems. Is there a most powerful proof system? So this is a question which is asked in many different contexts, and we will see what this will bring us to the one of the questions which was asked earlier. So let me see, do I have it on the very next slide? Maybe one slide later. So what is propositional proof complexity? Propositional proof complexity is, in this setting, we are going to talk about proof systems for tautologies. So we're looking at purely propositional formulas. You have a bunch of Boolean variables. You have connectives like logical and, or, not, XOR, whatever. That's it. You don't have any quantifiers. You don't have any other more higher order stuff. So you construct formulas like this. And then you ask, given a formula, is this formula valid? Is it the case that no matter how you assign values to the variables, the formula always evaluates to true? So you could ask whether a formula is valid, or you could ask whether the negation of the formula is unsatisfiable. So clearly this is, when you view it as unsatisfiability, it's a co-NP problem. It's co-NP complete. Now, From the computation complexity viewpoint, we know that NP consists of languages where yes instances have short proofs. Now we are sitting in co-NP. So we do not know that yes instances have short proofs. We only know that no instances have short proofs. But we never specified what exactly we mean by a proof. So maybe we can play around with different proof systems and try to come up with proofs as short as possible and see how far we go. So what can we say at this point? Well, if there is some proof system which is polynomially bounded, that is every tautology family has small proofs, then that would imply that NP is equal to co-NP. Quite frankly, if you ask me, I don't believe that that is the case. I don't know whether this is a universal belief or no. So asking whether co-NP is completely contained in NP is like asking whether the non-existence of a witness, which is exactly what co-NP talks about, does that always imply the existence of a proof? And now in this I have kind of removed the words short proof or efficient, but they are all there at the back of our head. Okay. So how could one design proof systems which even allow us to find proofs for statements of this form? Well, there are many different approaches which have been used in the literature, and here all I've done is I've tried to group these systems into 4 major groups and just listed out the names of some of these proof systems. If you have already seen these proof systems before, something may come to mind at this stage. But if it doesn't matter, because I'm not going to get into the technicalities of any specific proof system. Really here I want to try and discuss what is it that we are trying to do with different proof systems rather than into the technical details. So the approaches here is one could use a purely logical approach. You're trying to infer something and you can allow rules. So the rule in resolution, for instance, says that if you know that F1 or F2 is true, this is an instance of a cut rule. Let me describe the cut rule. If you know that F1 or F2, where or is logical or, so the formula F1 or F2 is true. And somebody else also tells you that the formula negation F2 or F3 is true. Then it doesn't matter what is the structure of F1, F2, F3. From this I can conclude that either F1 or F3 must be true, because F2 cannot simultaneously be true or false. This is what we call a cut rule in logic. And using a rule of this form, but in specific syntax, like saying that F1 must be of this form, F2 must be of this form, that now is going to give me an instance of the cut rule of a specific form. So resolution is one such rule, where you only look at clauses. But there are various other such rules. So there are these systems called Frege and extended Frege, which use the modus ponens rule. So these are what we understand rules which come from logical reasoning. You can build proof systems out of these, and these proof systems are able to always prove the validity of propositional tautologies. We also have geometric proof systems whose correctness, the fact that they are indeed proving unsatisfiable, something which is actually unsatisfiable, relies on viewing these Boolean points as sitting somewhere in a n-dimensional space, and then thinking of hyperplanes which are cutting off some polytope, and then you're trying to show not just that the polytope is empty, because in fact the polytope may not be empty, but you want to show that its integer, its intersection with the integer lattice is empty. So the geometric proof systems are based on these approaches, cutting planes, stabbing planes. There are algebraic proof systems which use identities from algebra, in particular Hilbert's Nulscher inserts, and a version of that which is called the polynomial calculus. There are some semi-algebraic systems. So the point is that there are many different approaches which are capturing kinds of inferences. Each one of them is going to come with its own strengths and its own limitations. And that is the challenge. In a specific setting, which of these approaches should we use? So a status report, what do we know in the propositional proof complexity about various such questions? Verifying proofs, what is the complexity of verifying a proof? In almost all these, in all the proof systems that I wrote out earlier, the complexity of verifying the proofs is P. Okay? So given a proof in that proof system, it's tractable, checking whether it's a valid proof or no. Sometimes, so there are proof systems which I did not even list there earlier, sometimes the checking of the proof may require randomness. I've written BPP, bounded error probabilistic polynomial time, but actually the verification is RP, maybe even ZPP, so subclasses of BP. There I would say, I believe that it's eventually is going to be equal to P. So verification should be tractable. Okay. What about the length of the proof? So remember our questions were, how hard is it to check the proof? How long does the proof? I'm going to go through these questions one by one. So how long does the proof need to be? Well, for many of these proof systems, we do know exponential lower bounds. Like I mentioned the example of the pigeonhole formula. Another example would be based on the handshake lemma, and the complete graph and an odd number of vertices cannot have a perfect matching. there are systems, many systems where an encoding of this is hard to prove. Okay? It requires exponential length. What about the existence of a strongest or an optimal proof system? Well, this is still open. This is a question which was raised more than 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. Yeah, 40 years ago. And we still do not know. And this is completely out of kilter with what we know for computational problems. I mean, for computational problems, any reasonable computational complexity class has complete problems. In fact, when we say that a class does not have complete problems, oh, it must be a promise class, oh, it must be a semantic class, there must be something different about it. But here we do not know the existence of optimal proof systems for tautologies. In fact, we also know various implications that would follow. If there are no optimal proof systems, then NP is not equal to co-NP. Okay? If there are no optimal proof systems, then we can even scale up and say that exponential at the level of exponential time, non-determinism cannot be complemented. And yeah, linear exponential time, linear so you cannot remove non-determinism if there are no optimal systems. But here is a different kind of result, which says that if there is an optimal proof system for tautologies, then there is a complete disjoint NP pair. Now, this is a very strange thing, and this disjoint NP pairs is something which I do not understand. It keeps coming up in the literature on proof complexity that I read. I would like to understand it better. But essentially, what are these disjoint NP pairs? You just take two NP languages, A and B, which are disjoint from each other. Okay? Put them together, that's a disjoint NP pair. Now, when would you say that a disjoint NP pair is complete? I want a disjoint NP pair to be complete for the class of all disjoint NP pairs. So I need a notion of when does one pair reduce to another pair, right? And the way this is set up is AB reduces to CD if there is a single algorithm, a single reduction F, which takes A to C and B to D. But remember, A and B are disjoint, C and D are disjoint. And the fact that you want a single reduction which maps both of these makes it incredibly hard. We do not know whether there are complete disjoint NP pairs. So the question is, what is the intuition for complete disjoint pairs being linked to optimality?
Yeah, or I mean, even just complete this joint NP pair. Like, what's the point of this object?
So the point of this object, yeah. So you want to preserve the disjointness of two sets. Both of them are in NP, but if you go from A to C, you have to stay within this part, you have to stay out of that part. So somehow you are building into the fact that you have a pair, the fact that you can respect both NP and co-NP predicates.
But where should this arise? Like,
I've seen it arise only in this context, that it is linked to the question of optimal proof systems.
So what would be a 50,000 feet view of this linkage? I mean, it just seems to me to be really out of nowhere.
Okay, I'm not sure I can answer this very well because I also don't understand this too well, what exactly the disjoint NP pairs are doing. The way I view it is that it is a different perspective on whether you have optimality in proof systems at all. But maybe there is something more to it which I do not know. Yeah. It's on my stack. It's been on my stack for a long time, understanding this better. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, can I restate the single algorithm part? So we know when does a language A reduce to a language C? There is an algorithm F which reduces instances of A to instances of C without changing membership. Right? Now I have a pair AB and I have a pair CD. And I should have this single algorithm, let's call that algorithm F. It transforms A instances to C instances, and the same F transfers B instances to D instances. And A and B are disjoint, C and D are disjoint.
One of my confusions is, suppose there are two different algorithms, one that was, so the pairs were A, B and C, D, let's say, the one that takes A from C and B to D, two different algorithms, and now I think of these functions as like a combined function.
Right, so when I combine them, I need to know which one to apply.
Okay.
Because you're not allowed to change what is finally, so you don't have pairs at the other end. You don't have a pair X, Y, and either X belongs to C or Y belongs to D. You have to decide a priori which of these you're doing. So that is the problem, that you do not know which of A and B you are in. They are both NP. They could potentially both be NP complete, but they are disjoint.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Yeah. If they are both complete, you would have two reductions. The question here is, do you have one reduction? Okay, like I said, I don't understand this well enough, so maybe I should not linger on this point too long. Let's move to the next question. The next question was, how hard is it to find proofs? Can one find the shortest proof, optimal proof length? Can one find the optimal proof itself? Can one approximate the optimal proof length? And here it's a really mixed bag. It depends on what proof system we are looking at. So if you look at the extended Frege, which is an extremely powerful proof system for which we do not know any lower bounds, if this is automatable, and what we mean by automatable in this context is that it is possible to find proofs in time polynomial in the length of the proof. The proof itself may be exponential in the length of the formula. But if the shortest proof length is L, then I can find some proof in time poly L. Okay? That is automatable. And now if extended Frege is automatable, then crypto breaks. Okay? So wait,
Some crypto.
Some crypto breaks, RSA and Diffie-Hellman in particular. Extended Frege, below that we have Frege, below that we have various subclasses of Frege. In particular, there is a class called TC0 Frege. So this is referring to the syntax of the individual lines. Each line in a TC0 Frege proof looks like a small depth circuit using threshold gates. So some kind of a neural net. Yeah? Where was the question?
Optimality in which sense? Yeah. You said there doesn't exist any optimal, I think it's propositional proof system, right?
Yeah. So PPS is propositional proof system.
Yeah. So optimal in which sense?
Optimal as in it can simulate all other proof systems.
Okay.
That's say, so an optimal proof system is the most powerful proof system, right? Yeah.
In some sense here, the optimality is like the analog for completeness.
It's exactly. So completeness for languages and with respect to reductions, optimality for proof systems with respect to simulations.
So in that sense, I mean, even though it simulates, does that imply that the proof sizes will be better or not worse at least or anything like
Not
that?
worse. I mean, the proof sizes could even be slightly bigger, but not more than polynomially bigger.
Yeah, okay, poly, sure.
Yeah, polynomial factors we are allowing anyway. Yeah, so this TC0 Frege is a subclass of Frege for which also we do not know lower bounds yet. And so I would say in strength it is intermediate. Probably it is very powerful simply because we don't yet know any lower bounds, but it's hard to say. But even for this system, if it is automatable, if proofs can be found quickly, even via some quantum algorithm, that would break a different crypto. It would break learning with errors. Right? So proof search, we don't expect it to be easy, or we hope that it is not easy. Right? We want our crypto to. Sorry? But what do I mean by the strength of a proof system? I mean, a proof system will be stronger if it can produce shorter proofs. Okay. So what I mentioned in the very first slide, that the length of the proof very often depends on the ability of the proof checker, right? So proof checker who is weak will want every detail spelled out. And therefore, the proof system will have to work at that weak level. A stronger proof system will have shorter proofs. Yeah. Resolution is a relatively weak proof system. But even for resolution, it was proved 5-6 years ago that if it is automatable, then NP collapses to P. So this was a surprising result, because whether resolution proofs can be found or no was something that had been bothering people for years. And resolution, even though it's a weak system, has been of very intense focus of study for many people, because this is what underlies today's SAT solving algorithms. Most SAT solving algorithms which are doing extremely well in practice are using some form of resolution or the other. So to understand better what resolution can do and what it cannot do is something which is of great interest. We don't really know.
Is it natural, or am I missing something, that as your proof system is becoming weaker, automatability is giving stronger consequences?
Yeah, that's what you would expect as we go down from here, but then you go further down. Tree-like resolution is very weak. And there, in fact, we know that it is almost automatable. No consequences as such. We know that you can find the shortest tree-like resolution proof. If it's of size S, then I can find one of size roughly S to the log n.
So, Meena, I think I'm confused about something basic. I mean, just very intuitively, right? If the proof system is more powerful, if I can automate it, it ought to be able to do more for me, right? But here it seems like the opposite is happening.
It's well, here it's not quite clear that it's the opposite. It just seems to be going in all over the place. It's
Oh,
in,
maybe I'm applying my own idea of which of these are harder problems, because I feel that RSA Diffie-Hellman fine. I mean LWE should be harder and PNP should be
right, but then there is a third line. So like I said, yeah, here it's going down in this way, and then after that it's not. So it like went up like. So then it is not a linear behavior.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
But
the
I
problem.
mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But
So-
the first three, I
First 3 years. So I have just picked which systems to write out here, and then by now there are many other systems which are not quite in a linear simulation order, for which we also have NP hardness. So there are many proof systems for which automatability now we know is NP hard. And then there are these ultra weak systems for which we have some kind of quasi automatability. What is the connection to algorithms? So here is another reason why propositional proof complexity is really significant and important. Different reasoning approaches, that's what we are trying to formalize in different proof systems. Are you using algebraic reasoning, are you using geometric reasoning, and so on. These are, but actually they are capturing the essence of different algorithmic paradigms themselves. So in particular, if I have lower bounds in a proof system, if I am able to show lower bounds in a proof system, then it would imply lower bounds on the runtime of an algorithm which is essentially using the logic of that proof system. And as examples here I have a list. Tree-like resolution is a proof system which explains what goes on in a particular SAT solving algorithm. So just trying to decide whether a propositional formula is satisfiable, there is this family of algorithms from the 60s, from even well before much of computational complexity was on a firm footing. The Davis-Putnam and the Davis-Logum and Langland algorithms, they are from 1960 and 1962. They try to solve, check whether a formula is satisfiable, essentially by implementing some kind of backtracking. And what this says, the fact that we know that some formulas require exponential size and tree-like resolution can be recast into an argument that backtracking algorithms for SAT will require exponential time. Okay? So it's giving that algorithmic lower bound, but it's casting it in the language of this proof system. Similarly, resolution, not tree-like, but general resolution. Resolution has been studied since the 70s. The Cook-Rekhau paper from 79 already had something to say about resolution. The first lower bound for resolution came in 85. It was in the mid-90s that this practical SAT solving, not proof systems, but practitioners trying to determine SAT, there was a major revolution. Suddenly SAT solving became easy. As complexity theorists, we are still sitting saying, NP complete, very hard problem, SAT and all. You ask any practitioner, reduce it to SAT, oh good, we're done. We know how to solve it. So SAT is a solved problem. They are looking well beyond SAT. And why is SAT a solved problem? Because of a certain algorithmic paradigm called conflict-driven cross-learning, which came in the mid-90s. 2 papers in 95 and I shouldn't say papers, 1 paper and 2 implementations, because these are practitioners. 2 tools which were built in 95 and 96, which were able to solve them, and then their subsequent improvements. They can now solve SAT instances with millions of variables very, very fast.
So is this something that can be formalized in some way? Like SAT is obviously NP hard, but maybe is it known for average case hardness?
Yes, it can be formalized, and I think it will come on my next slide. Yeah. Okay. So lower bounds in this proof system resolution explain slow runtimes in CDCL style algorithms. Lower bounds for cutting planes or stabbing planes explain lower bounds in a different kind of geometric algorithms which are trying to use Chatal-Gomori cuts or branch and bound algorithms. There are these other proof systems which I very briefly mentioned. Like I said, the actual definition here does not matter, but they are explaining what goes on in these optimization algorithms which look at LP relaxations, semi-definite programming relaxations, and they are giving us the exact correspondence. Not an exact correspondence, they are giving us lower bounds. So how are these lower bounds proved? Well, they're proved using many different techniques. There's like some combinatorial analysis, there are logical constructs which are used, there's a transfer across models, many different ways. And despite all these lower bounds, in practice we are saying SAT is a solved problem. Why is this happening? So here's this question. So when we say that we have lower bounds, what we have is adversarial handcrafted instances. They are showing worst case hardness. You could even take random instances. They have no structure whatsoever. So because they have no structure whatsoever, you expect them to be hard. That would give average hardness. And indeed, it is the case that for many, in particular for resolution, which explains the success of these SAT solvers which use CDCL. For resolution, we know that a random formula you pick is going to be hard. It's going to require exponential length. And why do real world instances work so well? Why do the SAT solvers work so well on real world instances? Well, those instances have structure. Real world instances are not pulled out of a hat at random. They have structure. You may not write your SAT algorithm specifically to exploit that structure, but it ends up exploiting it. Without knowing that it is doing so, it ends up exploiting that structure, and therefore it becomes easy. So this is one of the questions that one would like to answer. What exactly makes a formula hard? So here are some of the challenges I have listed out for propositional proofs. Better understanding the usefulness of structure. For instance, resolution we know is equivalent to CDCL, but CDCL is not an algorithm, it's a template. It's an algorithmic paradigm, and viewed as an algorithmic paradigm, it has some inherent non-determinism. When you actually write a SAT solver based on CDCL, what you mean? Here is the CDCL template. There is some step here which says do one of these things. Now you write a deterministic subroutine which tells you which of those things to do. So there is a determinized version of CDCL. Do these determinized versions correspond to resolution? There are multiple determinized versions. Do none of them do? Do we actually have a separation? We still do not know. We know for some deterministic versions that they are definitely weaker than resolution. So that is just telling us that, okay, we know non-determinism has power. That is no surprise to most of us here. But we would like to understand what's happening in these practical algorithms. So we need to understand better how non-determinism is using that structure. Understanding which approaches to use a logical based stuff or a geometric solver. This is something which we still do not have a good enough understanding. This is definitely a question to which people are paying a lot of attention now. Towards non-optimality, there are theoretical approaches towards creating infinite chains of proof systems which are more and more powerful. A jump operator takes one proof system and lifts it to a proof system which it expects to be more powerful, and then apply that same operator to get something which is even more. Now, if you can show that this is an infinite ascending chain, then you know that there is no optimality. We expect that there is no optimality. We are not yet there to proving it. We are probably very far from proving it, but there are approaches like this which also involve proof complexity generators. There's a lot of work there to be done. There's also a trade-off between succinctness and verifiability. If your proof system is very strong, it uses complex reasoning steps, the proofs become short, but they become harder to verify. And you need both. You don't want too long proofs, but you want verifiable proofs. So this trade-off is now giving rise to newer formats for proof systems, which perhaps you don't use them in the process of finding a proof. You think of a SAT solver as an algorithm which implements proof search because it's trying to find a proof. But having found a proof one way or the other, it should then write down the proof. So many algorithms now will use a particular reasoning approach to find the proof and a different approach to write down the proof. Proof logging uses a different proof system as opposed to the proof search. So here are some questions to do with propositional proof system, but I want to spend some time talking about what happens beyond propositional. Propositional is still talking about NP and co-NP. Are they the same or are they not the same? Okay, maybe they are not the same. Almost certainly they are not the same. But one can talk about proof systems for other languages also, not just for tautologies, beyond co-NP. For instance, we could talk about proof systems for optimization problems. And one such setting would be proof systems for MaxSat. What is the maximum number of clauses that can be satisfied in a formula? Proof systems for model counting, SharpSat. So there are many proof systems which are now being designed for this problem. Practitioners have been doing model counting for the last 25 years. But it's only in the last 6 or 7 years that I've been hearing about formal proof systems for this problem. The theory is lagging behind practice. Okay. No. As opposed to propositional proof systems where theory and practice both started off long ago but did not talk to each other until the CDCL revolution happened. Okay. But in the case of model counting, there is a huge gap. And now there are proof systems coming up for this, and hopefully they will do a good job of explaining what is actually happening in practice. One could also talk about proof systems for problems which are way beyond SAT. Okay? So SAT, NP I think of as something describing the essence of one-person games, solitaire or Sudoku or something like that. You could go beyond that to two-person games or multiplayer team games. And when you try to encode who can win in such a game in a formula, then you typically end up requiring some kinds of quantifiers. Because it's a two-person game, if I want to say that I can win, I would like to say that I know a way of playing so that no matter how you play, I know a way of responding There exists for all quantifiers come into the play, so you don't have quantifier free formulas. But then you still need proof systems which will allow you to determine whether these formulas are true or false. So one could talk about proof systems for such more complicated formalisms. In particular, why QBFs and DQBFs, I have mentioned these here, which capture two-party or multi-party games. These are formalisms beyond propositional formulas. They are really useful for encoding real-life constraints. It's not that they can encode things that you can't encode with SAT. We are still in the world, we are not using higher order, first order logic. Okay, so we can still encode the same things, but the encoding becomes much more succinct. It's much more transparent, explaining what exactly this formula says. So, I mean, in the world of explainable AI, I think it would be great to go in this direction. Okay, you can understand what the formula is actually trying to assert. So, because they are doing this in a much more succinct way, it's going to make proving stuff about them harder. But it still could be quite good to use in structured instances. It could be that we have solvers for QBF which on structured instances are efficient. So we would like to understand whether indeed these solvers are good and what is the proof, what is the logical system underlying them. So that's why we have proof systems for QBFs. QBFs look like this. Here's an example of a QBF. There exists X for every Y, there exists Z, there exists Y, a bunch of constraints. And typically we assume that the QBFs are fully quantified. Every variable is quantified and all the quantifiers appear right in the beginning. So that means that this is a sentence. It has a value either true or false. We don't talk about SAT or unsat. Is this formula true or is it false? We want to decide that. That's p-space complete, a much larger class than NP or co-NP. But unlike with NP and co-NP, we don't know whether they are the same. We don't know whether non-determinism can be complemented. With p-space, there is no such asymmetry. We already know that it can be complemented. So what happens if we have a proof system for a p-space complete language, in particular for QBF, in which there are always short proofs? P-space would collapse to NP, as opposed to co-NP collapsing to NP. So this is a much bigger collapse. So it's much more unlikely. So since it's much more unlikely, it should be easier to prove lower bounds. It should be easier to prove that, in fact, proof systems are not polybounded. Is it really easier? I don't know. I have spent the last 10 years proving lower bounds, and yes, we do have many lower bounds, but I don't think that they were easy to obtain. What I can say is that certainly there were many more techniques for obtaining lower bounds in QBF than there were in the propositional case. And that's because you can actually use these properties of the two-player games. What would a QBF proof system would look like? It has to deal with the universal variables differently, because in a formula like this, if there is no universal quantification, everything is there exists, then you can forget this part and it's a satisfiability question. What makes it a QBF is the fact that you have universal variables, universally quantified variables. You have to treat them differently. And there are various different ways in which you can treat them. Again, some names, some terms, which I'm not going to technically describe. But what they are doing is trying to say what is the semantics of this universal variable? What exactly does it mean? No matter how this player responds at this point in choosing the value of this variable, I should be able to proceed in a certain way. So it's a conjunction. You can expand it out. You can reduce it by adversely choosing the worst possible choice, because the opponent is supposed to be able to succeed no matter what you do. Or you can start putting together partial strategies for this universal player. You could use some kind of computation of partial strategies. So strategies in what? This maybe I should very briefly describe that. But just to give you a flavor of, here is a small subsection of the large zoo of QBF proof systems. There's an even larger zoo of propositional proof systems. But within proof systems for QBF, these systems here are all based on resolution. When we talk about propositional proof systems, there's that one weak system resolution before we go to other approaches. Just plain old resolution adapted to QBF is giving rise to so many proof systems. So for each propositional type, there are going to be many more proof systems in the QBF setting, and just figuring out what are their relative strengths is quite a nightmarish task. So what do I mean by strategies? Because that word strategies is going to come again on the next slide as well. So here is a QBF, and imagine that there are two players. There is a universal player, there is an existential player. They take turns setting values to these variables. Choose true or false, choose true or false, and so on. And then finally, when they reach here, all the variables have a value. So you plug it into the formula, check whether it's true or false. If it's true, the existential player has won, because the existential player said, I know a way of choosing it to make this true. The QBF is false exactly when the universal player has a strategy to win. Not just can win on one particular run, but can always win. Okay. No matter how the opponent plays, the universal player can always ensure that something here becomes false. That's a strategy. And because the falseness of QBFs is exactly the same as the existence of a strategy, you can think of a QBF proof as something which is trying to find that strategy. In the case of SAT solvers, you could think of them as trying to search for a satisfying assignment, and at some point when they've exhausted everything, they give up and say, no, the formula is unsatisfiable. Here you can think of it as trying to search for a strategy for the existential player, and when that fails, there is no such strategy, okay, then the QBF must be false. One could view things this way. So this is one role that strategies have to play. Actually, strategies have very important roles in QBF proof systems. One role that they play is in showing that a system is sound. That is, the system does not end up proving that a formula is false when actually that formula is true. That is often proven by doing what we call strategy extraction. You give me a proof. I want to now check this proof and conclude that indeed the original formula was false. I look at this proof, I extract a strategy from it, and I show that this strategy is a winning strategy for the universal player. That's one role that the strategies can play. So strategy extraction becomes very useful. If we can extract strategies from proofs, then we can use them to synthesize witnesses. And the synthesizing witnesses is the number one application of QBF solvers. We are trying to implement QBF solvers today to decide truth or falsity of QBFs, but we don't just want a binary answer at the end, yes, true, no, false. We want those witnesses, and those witnesses are going to be used in whatever practical applications that threw up these QBFs in the first place. So the number one application, like I said, is some kind of function synthesis, and that comes from strategy extraction. And for me, as a proof, complexity theory is the most useful thing about strategies, is that I can use them to show that a formula is hard to refute. How do I do that? I do the following. I show that for some formula, all winning strategies are hard in a computational model. So again, now I go back from logical reasoning to computation. I show that all winning strategies are hard in some model. And now if I show that strategies in that computational model can be efficiently extracted from proofs, then it must be the case that the proofs must all be long. If there were even one short proof, then from that short proof, I would be able to extract a small representation of a winning strategy in that corresponding model. And if we have already proved that that's not possible, then we have this contradiction. So the main challenge here would be, okay, you are going to stare at a proof. The proof shows that the formula is false. Therefore, implicitly, it says that yes, the universal player has a winning strategy. Can I extract it? When I extract it, what will it look like? Will it look like a algorithm that you run on your laptop? Will it look like a Boolean circuit? Will it look like an arithmetic circuit? The model matters, because that's where we're going to use the lower bounds. So this is a big challenge, identifying the right computational model. For instance, for all of those resolution-based QBF proof systems that I showed in that zoo, I can use this feasible interpolation technique, which was used very effectively even in the propositional case for in the geometric reasoning setting to prove lower bounds. For all the resolution-based QBF proof systems, I could use this, and I can extract winning strategies represented as Boolean circuits. If the QBF formula has some nice additional structure, I can extract monotone Boolean circuits, and then I can use non-monotone Boolean circuit lower bounds. If I have this one particular system called resolution and universal reduction, then the first attempt at extracting strategies from here, which was around 12 years ago, gave depth 3 circuits. Depth 3 Boolean circuits using AND or NOT gates. And then a closer examination said, oh, hey, these are not just any depth 3 circuits, they are something which lies between depth 3 and depth 2. They are decision lists. Decision lists are now all over the place, but here now you can examine these decision lists more closely. They were decision lists where the decisions were based on a conjunction of literals. And so then lower bounds for these would give lower bounds for the corresponding proof system. The geometric reasoning, cutting planes proof system, when I augment it with this reduction rule to get a QBF system, strategies could be extracted as linear decision lists. Linear decision lists are again things that you can do by applying a series of threshold functions. And then there is this merge resolution. This is some work that I had done 5-6 years ago, where we extracted strategy. We defined this new proof system so that the strategies are built into it by design. It was a different approach to constructing a proof system itself. And in this proof system, strategies did not have to be extracted. Strategies were explicitly written in the proof. They were written as branching programs. So there are many such computational models. There's also, for this system, resolution plus universal reduction, here I've said that you can extract strategies as depth 3 circuits or conjunction decision lists, but you can't go back. There are formulas for which there are small conjunction decision lists, but no small proofs. And in some work which again I did 5-6 years ago with some of my collaborators, we proved that there is an exact characterization using a different model, what we call unified multi-output decision lists. The catch here is that this model itself needs a semantic check. If I just give you a multi-output decision list, is this a unified list in the sense that we need? I don't know how to check that in P. It requires access to NP. This is a matter of taste. Is it a problem that you need NP? The reason why we are doing QBF proof systems in the first place is because practitioners are saying that SAT is easy and let's do QBF, let's write QBF solvers. If SAT is easy, I can call a SAT solver to get the answer to this. So testing using an NP oracle, although it is not ideal, in the setting of QBF proof systems, it makes sense and we are going to allow this. So with that, then we have a very tight correspondence between the complexity of strategies and the complexity of proofs in this setting. There's another setting, static proof systems based on some kind of algebra or maybe even on some semi-algebra, the positive Chelensatz or the null Chelensatz. These were done for, these systems for propositional formulas have been studied for several years, but it was not clear at all how to extend this to QBFs, and we did this last year. It required a very different approach to encoding the strategies. Finally, we encoded them as polynomial threshold functions. Now, this was again something very nice because polynomial threshold functions is something that people who work in Boolean function complexity do use frequently. And they have already given us lower bounds in that model, that certain Boolean functions require large degree in polynomial threshold functions. They require a large number of monomials. By giving a proof system which encodes strategies like this, we are now able to import those lower bounds into the proof system and say that any solver for QBFs which is based on this reasoning will require a long time on certain formulas. Okay, so this was a very short glimpse about what happens in the QBF proofs. What are the challenges, questions ahead for QBF proof systems? Main thing is to explain the success and limitations of practical solvers. That was also a question for propositional proof systems, but I think it's a more compelling question for QBFs because QBFs, I mean, after all, it's a harder complexity class. So the reason why we are looking at QBF proof systems in the first place is because people are writing solvers for them. Okay. So we want to find more insights that can guide solver design. We want to understand why is it that some runs are long. Of course, runs will be long when there are no short proofs, but sometimes runs are long even when there are short proofs. And we were able to show recently that sometimes there are short proofs, the solver can find those short proofs, but it takes inordinately long. So this is an analog of the proof search problem, that it's not that the complexity of the proof itself is the hindrance, it's the complexity of proof search, that computational task that is the hindrance. We want to use strategy extraction more effectively for synthesis, for verification, the standard applications of QBF. And in this world, I have seen actually, there's something called counterexample guided refinement, which has been used reasonably effectively in solving QBFs. It seems to be well suited to exploiting ML. I have heard in the last 2-3 years at the QBF workshop, people presenting work which is doing stuff like this using ML. I do not yet see the underlying theory there. We cannot go plunge into using more and more of these kinds of tools without understanding why they work. So there is work to be done there as well. Basically, in the QBF world, there is a closer theory-practice connect. The theory has been following the practice, and it has to do it has a much harder task cut out explaining what is happening in practice. Okay, a couple of minutes on beyond QBF. QBF was P-space, and then I also mentioned DQBF. So that was, QBF is like a two-party game, the there exists and the for all. But DQBF is a multi-party game. So a DQBF looks like this. For every x1, x2 to xn, there exists a y1 which depends only on some of these x's. There exists a y2 which depends only on these. There exists a ym which, such that the inner formula is true. Why do I say that this is a multi-party game? In the previous setting, there were two players, the universal and the existential. Now there are two teams, the universal team and the existential team. Each team has several players, one player per variable. Okay? And those players can talk to each other, they can figure out their strategy and all. But once the game starts, they cannot talk to each other. Okay. So once the game starts, these players are going to choose the values for their variables. And now these players, the Y players, they have to choose those values. But each Y player is not seeing all of X, is seeing only a small window. And based on that has to give a particular value of Y, hoping that eventually the inner formula will get satisfied. So the existential team players have a limited view, but with that limited view, they still want to achieve some success. This is an extremely hard problem. Deciding whether there is a strategy for the existential player, it's not just p-space, it's non-deterministic exponential time complete. Okay. So if it is that hard, why are we even looking at it? Again, because it can encode some things succinctly in a much more explainable way. It explains what is actually going on in the practical application that we're looking at. And people are writing DQBF solvers now. They are nowhere near the state of where QBF solvers are now. QBF solvers already have reached the stage where they can deal with thousands of variables. DQBF solvers, it's a much more nascent thing. But there are proof systems for DQBF which are being designed by augmenting and lifting QBF proof systems. And there is quite a bit of work there which still needs to be done, because some ways of lifting simply do not work. They lead to systems which are unsound, which are incomplete, which can't prove everything to be proved, or which give fake proofs. There are some systems which work. In particular, this merged REST system, which I mentioned that we had defined a few years ago, which had strategy extraction built into the proof, that lifts extremely smoothly to DQBF. Okay. So I remember when I first heard DQBF, I said, DQBF is NEXP complete. Are these even real? And there was a talk I was giving somewhere where, I mentioned this, and after the talk, one of the practitioners came up to me and said, you think you're doubting DQBF? We are writing solvers for problems which we know are undecidable. It doesn't matter, because the instances of those undecidable problems that we have to solve, we are able to solve. We just put a timeout. If we don't get an answer in so many hours, then we stop. Okay. So there's a good reason to look at this. The challenges in DQBF proofs are at a higher level because there is less that has already been done. What are the logical constructs that we can actually extend? How can we use them? What syntactic structure is dictating hardness? What do we mean by proof search? Various questions. So the questions are changing. And maybe let me close now with this one slide, which tells me from a computational complexity perspective what is happening. NP, we know that there are proofs of polysize which are verifiable in P. Co-NP, if the same thing happens, then co-NP collapses to NP. So that's complementing non-deterministic time. At P space, we can't collapse non-deterministic space. They are already collapsed. But if there are polynomial size efficiently verifiable proofs, then non-deterministic space collapses to non-deterministic time. At NEXP, polytime verifiable proofs simply do not exist. We already know that. But exponential time verifiable proofs, if they exist, then non-deterministic time collapses. So this is like a nice picture of what is happening at different classes, but you notice that deterministic exponential time is missing. What would be the proof complexity construct that explains what is happening here? For instance, if I want to collapse time to space, what kind of proofs are we seeking? What length of proofs, what nature of proofs, where they are verifiable? This is something that we don't know. So there's a lot that we can look at beyond propositional proofs. I've just listed here, there are several seminars which have been happening at Dachstuhl and Oberwolfach talking about propositional and beyond. So proof complexity does not stop at NP and co-NP. There's a whole lot of stuff happening beyond that, which is really interesting. And in particular, as we head towards automated reasoning, interactive theorem proving, we need to pay attention to these questions beyond that. So here's at each section, I ended with what are the challenges in those sections, and here I've just put them together in one slide. And let me finally close with this line. The closing line in the textbook on proof complexity by Krajcik is the hardness of proving genuinely different from the hardness of computing. The way he phrases it, it's clear he does not believe that it is genuinely different. I am still open-minded about this, but computations and proof are really very, very closely linked. I think we should not be treating them as different objects. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Meena again. And we'd like to present a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much.